over the weekend on Tuesday. I'll talk about the practice question from the standpoint of insider trading law, which will be a good review, I hope, for some of you. And yeah, and then on Friday we'll have one last office hours. A few points that came out in yesterday's office hours, I'll just make sure everyone is on the same page. Probably you won't see on the exam questions like, very, very fine, nuanced rules that we didn't really spend a lot of time on, but you might see some hypotheticals that involve either the bid-ask spread calculation. Nobody should be surprised if there's a 9 and 11 question. Also, you might see some questions regarding, Section 11 liability. Make sure that you understand BarChris and WorldCom. All right, so that material is fair game. Insider trading. What is a security? All right, so as you're reviewing over the next week, make sure that you have a really good understanding of those topics. I'm going to start substantively now by addressing a question, a very good question I got from Jessica, who's not here yet. No, and she asked about the Aranaz case and truth on the market. And so let me just take a minute and talk about truth on the market so everyone, as more come in, I'm like talking intentionally slowly. All right, so truth on the market. So what is truth on the market? So truth on the market is a little ambiguous as to what exactly it means. One way to think about truth on the market, where's Sam? He's not here yet either. Something going on today? Where is everyone? All right. So Sam came up to me a couple days ago and said, well, what if the price doesn't react when the corrective disclosure happens because everyone kind of knows that the information that was being fed to the market was false, but everyone kind of knows that it was false. And so sort of knowing that it's false, or there's a chance that it's false, you're kind of not surprised when the truth comes out. So you could imagine, a company that's going out and talking very, sort of puffing up their products and sort of, kind of using language that suggests that things are going really well, but the market kind of knows that, that it's either unlikely to be true, or more common would be the sort of signaling story where if you have something really good to say, then you'll use a particular kind of language. And if you don't use that language, the market will infer actually that things are not as good as they seem. You could imagine, for example, a company like Apple saying, our iPhone sales are really strong, or very, and that might be perceived as less positive by the market than a statement like our iPhone sales have exceeded all expectations, right? And so one way to think of this truth on the market question is the extent to which the statement is understood by the market as having a misleading implication for the value of the firm. And the problem with that idea, right, is that it kind of starts to become an ex post inquiry, right? So we've talked about the danger of ex post inquiries, right? So if the price changed, therefore it must have been material. Well, yeah, that's what we use to prove materiality. That's what we use to prove price impact. But you can see in the case of a statement like, our iPhone sales were, very, very good. Okay, that statement could be perceived by the market as actually bad news. And so if you look at a price change ex post, and you say, well, I'm going to infer from that price change whether or not the statement is a misstatement, then you really have a circularity problem, and whatever is a misstatement is going to depend on the market's reaction to the information, which will turn on its expectations. And so effectively, and this was the point that we made in our conversation around Matt Levine's column, in which he said that we can think of securities law. He was discussing the Cambridge Analytica scandal, if you remember this, and he said, we can think of securities law as a kind of court of the people, right? That effectively it's a sort of crowdsourced judgment. And so the market's reaction to news is the market passing judgment on what that news means for the company. And it's not even clear that the market will react positively or negatively if the law, only if the law has been broken, or if there has been some sort of potential legal liability. It could just be that the market is unhappy. He was giving the example of the Cambridge Analytica scandal and saying, well, if you think about it from the standpoint of the market as sort of the judge, the crowdsourced judgment, then what you might say is that the market was unhappy about the agreement that Facebook reached with Cambridge Analytica, but that doesn't necessarily imply that anything legally. It doesn't imply that Facebook misled the market. It doesn't imply that there was a breach of contract. It definitely doesn't imply a data breach. So one way to think about this truth on the market question is how much are we going to let the market's reaction or lack thereof determine misstatements, the existence of a misstatement, right? So if the market reacts negatively to the news or positively to the news, to let's say the corrective disclosure, are we going to use that as a measure of the truth or falsity of the original disclosure? And so the way that the truth on the market defense is, and let's just say because of this, there's no clear, there's no Supreme Court jurisprudence on truth on the market, right? This is arising out of lower court decisions that are faced with fact patterns where it seems like the market kind of is skeptical about the misstatements that form the basis of the fraud claim. So they might say, well, if the market is skeptical and therefore there's very little price reaction to the corrective disclosure, should we therefore conclude that there is either no price impact or that this corrective disclosure is immaterial, right? And it's a little bit of a puzzle, right? Because on the one hand, you kind of want to say, yeah, like if the market doesn't think this is a surprise, then it's really hard to articulate a price impact, right? I mean, it's sort of the definition of the lack of price impact is that the price doesn't move, meaning the market isn't surprised. But because we're using price impact typically to rebut basic, okay, then in effect, what we're saying is that the absence of a price impact in the truth on the market case is being used to rebut the presumption of reliance, of transaction causation. And here, it's not clear that the logic we used for market efficiency when we said, well, the reason why we'll allow defendants to show absence of price impact is because that suggests the market is not impounding information, and therefore there couldn't have been transaction causation in the sense of reliance on the market price. Remember, we discussed this, the integrity of the market price. Here, we would actually be using the truth on the market defense in exactly the opposite way. You see that? Because we would be saying that the market is, in fact, fully processing information. It's so good at fully processing information that it figured out that there was like a falsity here. And so there's a little bit of a perplexing, if you think about the logic of that, it's a little bit perplexing to say, well, we're going to allow defendants to prove lack of price impact by claiming not that the market is inefficient in processing information, but that the market is super efficient in processing information. right? And then, what does that mean, right? It means that the truth on the market defense effectively sort of would be deviating from the way that we've typically thought about price impact, about using the price impact defense. And so it turns out that in the Aronaz case, we have this, little quote that Jessica sent me, hi, that where this judge in the Southern District of Florida says, the truth in the market defense may not be used at the class certification stage to prove an absence of price impact so as to show a lack of predominance because it goes to materiality. As previously stated, the truth's presence on the market renders an alleged misrepresentation immaterial. And then they're citing this case which said if a misrepresentation is immaterial if the information is already known to the market because the misrepresentation cannot then defraud the market. All right, so here is one example. Some of you were asking yesterday at office hours, like, is there an example of truth on the market, of price impact and materiality diverging? And so here's kind of one possible example. Like I said to you many times, you have to really stretch your imagination to think of them. But one of them could be the truth on the market story, where you're going to say, it's not that actually in the data the two diverge, meaning there really is no price impact in the truth on the market case. Like there really is. The price does not move. But it doesn't make sense to use that lack of price impact to rebut fraud on the market because it's not really showing an inefficient market. It's actually showing a very efficient market. So we'll not embrace price impact, the price impact test in the truth on the market setting. Instead, we'll view it as a materiality question. And the nice thing about that, right, if you're a plaintiff, is that you get to proceed past the class certification stage. And that's good news. Now, it could be that your complaint gets kicked out for being immaterial, but at least you got your class certified. All right, questions? Amy?
So, what then is Carroll and Roper's point? Because they seem to be critical of the courts that are rejecting this truth on the market defense.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can read what they say.
Sure. Go for it.
I mean, for everyone kind of. So they say that's bad because it's inconsistent with considering all the relevant economic evidence. So I don't know, how are we supposed to understand?
Well, so they don't like separating these two tests, right? In part because they say, look, economically, if the price moves before the corrective disclosure, I mean, the market has figured it out. It's pretty simple, right? And not only, and we should defeat that. Look, they're consultants for defendants, right? So, they're kind of articulating this story in their view that, we should be allowed to rebut price impact and thereby kill the class certification as early as possible. Jessica, do you find this convincing? No? Oh, sorry. So we were just reiterating that. So, is truth on the market? Can truth on the market be used? And my point is, look, if we try to understand the Aronaz case, we can understand it as an attempt to rationalize the use of price impact and limit it to proving the absence of market efficiency. Right? That if you go back to BASIC, the reason for the existence of the fraud on the market presumption is that is the notion of an efficient market. Hence why in Halliburton 2, so much turned on the debate over market efficiency, and why the Supreme Court ultimately had to reject the claim that markets were completely inefficient, because if they accepted that, there would be no fraud on the market presumption. Yet the price impact test is used precisely for that reason, right? It's used to show that there was no price impact to the announcement and thus the market was inefficient. But in a truth on the market defense, what you're claiming is actually the reason why there's no price impact isn't that the market is inefficient at processing information, but it's really good at processing information. It's so smart that it figured out there was no lie. Martin.
This might be a kind of a remedial question, but just to clarify, the test doesn't care about the directionality of the signal versus the directionality of the price move. Like, say that the market knew there was some bad news out there, knew there was some misstatement, anticipated worse news than they ended up getting. So the signal, the kind of correction was a -1 about the value of the stock, but the result of that was that the stock price went up because the market had already incorporated some kind of even worse idea about what was going on inside the firm.
Right.
That doesn't matter to the court as long as there's like a significant movement.
Oh,
price,
nice. That's
right?
That's a cool question. So, great. So the price, right? So you tell the market things are great. The market says it's gotta be BS. All right, things are really bad because I don't know. If things were great, you would have said things are really great, and because you didn't say that, then things must be horrible. So the price starts declining every time you go out and say, good news, we're doing well. The market goes down because they think you didn't say we're doing amazing, okay? Whatever the story is, right? So the market goes down. So there's a misrepresentation, and the price starts updating the direction of the truth. So you think you have a truth on the market defense, in the sense that you would plead no price impact when you in fact announce that things were really bad. Things are really bad, the price doesn't move in my hypothetical. But Martin throws out a new hypothetical, which is that actually the price goes up. Statistically significant increase. Does everyone see that? Let me just draw on the whiteboard that nobody can see. We'll just imagine that, you know, the price is going down, okay, as you lie. You keep lying about how great, you know, this is a lie, this is a lie, this is a lie, you know, things are great. You know, there's so many fun hypotheticals you can think about in this area. So so it keeps going down. And then you tell the truth here. Nobody can see if I do this, right? Okay. You tell the truth. So lie, you tell the truth. And my story is that the price doesn't change. That was like the conversation we had. And Martin's story is, no, what if the price like skyrockets at that moment? Could happen, right? Because the truth could be that things are not as bad. Like, you really reacted, you overreacted in your pessimism. And like, things are bad, but they're not that bad. Yeah. I don't know. What do you think, Martin? What happens then?
I mean, assuming that like people are trading in this period where the price is declining, the logic seems to me the same. Just because there's a price impact from the misstatement and from the corrective statement, it seems to me like there are still people who lost out in that situation by selling at a price that wasn't the value of the thing.
Yeah. So there's probably all right. So let's be formal and sort of analytical, since you got an exam coming up. So so 10b5, is there a misstatement? Okay. Yes, there's a misstatement. All right. Is it material? Yes. I mean, it's clearly material, simply by the same evidence that we're going to use in just a minute to talk about price impact. When the price increased here, clearly it mattered to the market. Okay. Now, the question is price impact in the opposite direction, so to speak, of the information? Is it still price impact? And the answer is going to be yes. You still have price impact, meaning the defendant cannot rebut the fraud on the market presumption. Why? Because the fraud on the market presumption turns on the efficiency of the market. And so here, clearly, the market is efficient. It's processing the new information that it's received. It's just processing it in the opposite direction. Okay? So yeah, absolutely, the market's efficient. You have price impact. You don't get out of it if you're a defendant. You cannot rebut the fraud on the market presumption. Loss causation is going to be a lot trickier in this kind of a story. Okay? And so we're going to dive into Farrell and Saha, finish this up, and let's see what they have to say. You can keep the situation in mind, and we'll come back to it. Let me just respond to Adam's email. Is Adam here? Adam? Adam Swingle. He sent me an email, but he's not here? All right. Okay. Never mind. All right. Let's go back to the article. Okay. So So where we left off was we talked about the event study methodology. And what we're going to now do is finish up the article, which will tease out some of these fun hypotheticals. So if you look at their discussion in Section 3, when does a corrective disclosure occur? All right, there's a conversation about the requirement that there be a corrective disclosure. And they discuss a doctrine that some commentators and courts have accepted, this so-called market forces operating on the fraud theory. So let's just work through this hypothetical. Suppose that a widget manufacturer fraudulently states that it has spare capacity to build additional widgets so as to meet the market's demand for widgets in the event that demand for widgets increases. The stock price of the manufacturer increases, say, from $80 to $100. So in this story, okay, we're fraudulently telling the market that we have spare capacity to build additional widgets, and the stock price is increasing. Subsequent to, so then we have an investor here buys shares. Okay. Subsequent to the investor buying the shares at $100, this is $100, right? This is 80. All right. Subsequent to the investor buying the $100, the European Union imposes a tariff on widgets, which reduces the market demand for widgets and thus the value of having spare capacity. So you've lied to the market about your spare capacity, and here the value drops to 90. So the value of having spare capacity drops from 20 to 10. You all see that. Okay. This is on page 171. All right. Did the fraudulent, well, okay, after the imposition of the tariff, the investor sells the shares. So the investor lost $10 per share. All right. At no time does the market learn that the widget manufacturer's statement about having spare capacity is false. Did the fraudulent statement cause economic loss to the investor? More specifically, can the investor recover the amount of the disinflation? All right, the difference between inflation at the time of purchase and the inflation at the time of sale. All right. So if you're wondering, like, you know, what a multiple choice question will look like on the test, like, this is a good example, right? All right. So, so Farrell and Roper do not like the answer that they then discuss, which is that some commentators would argue that the investor did suffer recoverable damages. They articulate this market forces operating on the fraud theory as driven by the idea that the investor had to pay an inflated price for the shares initially as a result of the combined effect of the false statement, and then had to sell the shares at a less inflated price. And then they critique this, and they say, well, it doesn't really make sense to give damages in this situation in light of the language in Dura. So we're now moving away from the use of the event study methodology or the price change methodology to establish materiality or price impact, and we're now moving to loss causation. And their point is that it's very hard to understand how this decline in price was caused by the misstatement that led to the inflation. There was a misstatement about having spare capacity, and then a decline in price driven by the EU's tariff imposition. Their claim, which I think is probably the most likely one to be followed by the courts in this area, is that is not compensable, right? That cannot be recovered. Because Dura requires a causal connection between the damages you suffer and the misstatement. And here, you can clearly see that the damages the investor suffered were directly, proximately caused by the EU's tariff imposition. Does anyone disagree with Farrell and Saha? Does anyone think that that's wrong, what I just said? Yes?
I don't think it's wrong necessarily, but the price wouldn't have been that high to begin with, and therefore would not have dropped as much or dropped the same way after the tariffs were imposed.
Right. Very good. So Dexter says, look, the problem is the investor suffered damage immediately when he bought it at 100. Right, that's your point, exactly. The damages were inflicted by buying at an inflated purchase price. But what did Dura say? Right? Dura specifically rejected that claim. That was sort of the quote of the Ninth Circuit that Dura rejected. The notion that our investors' losses are compensable because he bought at 100 instead of 80 was exactly what the court rejected. Right? Right? Question mark. You ever sit in these faculty workshops, for those who have come from time to time, and law professor raises their hands and it's like a 5-minute speech, and then they say question mark? Nobody's ever seen that before? Question mark. Question mark. Jessica.
Just so I'm clear, Roper and Farrell's argument is still, like, there would still be compensable loss if the nominal decrease in the stock price was greater when the price of the stock was initially inflated, right? So, like, if the impact of the tariff decreased the stock price more because the price was initially inflated than it would have otherwise been without the misstatement.
So does it turn on it being 100 or 80? Is that what you're asking? Say it again. I'm not sure I follow.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding some of the premises. When is the misstatement? Is it at 80 or at 100?
The misstatement is here at the very beginning. The misstatement is we have spare capacity. The market ascribes a $20 increase in value because of that misstatement. The EU announces tariffs that reduce the value of spare capacity. The investor buys at a price that's inflated because of the misstatement.
Yeah, so if, like, the nominal decrease of $10 was less than $10 than if the tariff had been imposed when it was 80.
If the tariff had been imposed when it was 80, good, this is good analysis, what would have happened?
So, like, if the tariff had been imposed and then it only decreased $8, then the compensable loss due to the misstatement was 2.
So what we don't know, Jessica, this is good. What we don't know is what would have happened if the tariff had been imposed here.
Right.
We don't know that. Don't assume it, right? We don't know. You might be right, but we don't know. So, Joe.
Well, this might just be like a hypothetical, but it sounds like from the way you just described it that it wouldn't move at all if the tariff were imposed at 80 because the
right,
tariff
possibly.
Only affects the value of extra capacity.
Right, possibly. Elliot.
I was going to say maybe like if the stock, if they made a corrected disclosure and the stock went back down to 80, they could get that difference between 80 and 90. But I don't see how like the loss, with taking into account loss causation, you could get that difference between 100 and 90.
Okay, so this is Farrell and Saha reincarnated. Absolutely, that would be their claim, right? Mariah.
Couldn't we think about the tariff as like a corrective disclosure coming from a third party? And
Could we think of it as a corrective disclosure coming from a third party?
because it's like canceling out the effect of the misstatement regarding the capacity.
Ha. So it is in the price, but it's not a correction of the misstatement. That's the problem, right? You're right. It effectuates the same change in the price as if the misstatement had been corrected, well, half of the way, right? But it's not a correction of the misstatement. So go back to Jessica's point. What would have happened if the misstatement had happened here? So Elliot wants to say, look, none of this really matters because none of this has anything to do with measuring the effect of the misstatement. Like, the effect of the misstatement is the 80 to 100, and if the misstatement had been corrected and the stock price had fallen as a result, then fine, that's the corrective disclosure. But there's been no corrective disclosure. Thus, the market has never learned the truth. Thus, all of this is not caused by the misstatement. Does anyone disagree? Yes.
I don't know if I disagree, but if there's a misstatement, isn't the loss of value from 100 to 90, would everything be disclosed? Loss in value that doesn't really exist, right? Because the loss in value from 100 to 90 is based on a set of assumptions in the market that there is excess capacity when there really isn't.
Right. Right. Yeah. So this is like a fun one, right? Like this is mind-bending. Alistair, did you have a thought? Yeah.
So is the argument just that you can only measure the loss that has actually been caused when you have a corrective disclosure to measure that against?
Well, is that the argument, Alistair?
Like that's what it sounds like to me. So I'm asking because to me it sounds like they're saying that you can only measure what the loss is if you have a corrective disclosure to measure it against. Otherwise, the $20 rise might be due to idiosyncratic market reasons or industry-related reasons, and the $10 loss might be that as well.
Well, good. Well, let's grab a hold of something you said at the end, which was the $20 rise. So you should be a little skeptical of the idea that there's only one way to measure the harm here, which is the drop, if there were the hypothetical drop that never happened, if there were a corrective disclosure, which it never happened, but suppose that it did. Well, you actually have an increase of $20. So let's not assume away that increase driven by some other factor. Let's suppose that literally nothing happened in the intervening, and the facts all were given. Don't invent facts. Very important for multiple choice questions. Do not invent facts. Do not add anything. Do not say if something happened. If you're not told something happened, nothing happened. Okay? It's really simple. Just take the facts as they are. So if nothing happened, all you're told is that there was a lie here. Lie. And the price went up as a result. You actually know exactly how much the price went up by. So why can't we just say that the investor's loss was caused by buying at $100 when we can clearly measure the increase in the price? Why is that not loss causation? Amy?
I think it is when it's stylized like this, to make up and not make it back. You can imagine okay, you wouldn't have bought, but for the price when that goes up, because they cost spare capacity and not getting other factors. But
Yeah.
it's just in reality, you wouldn't know. You're saying not make up facts, but in reality, you wouldn't know that it
Yeah.
was a lie and that it did get you wouldn't know any of that until there was a correct disclosure.
Well, look, you could run an event study, okay, difference out the market over, let's go with, do you want to engage with the hypothetical? You don't like the hypothetical that nothing happened, so let's just suppose that the market, is doing whatever the market's doing, and, I don't know, suppose the market's flat. I don't know. You can just run an event study, difference out the market, and you're going to get... So, yeah, you don't know if there's some other firm-specific thing happening. That's true. But I don't think that's really crucial. This is the key point. Under Dura, this definitely is not compensable. You need to understand that. Joe's point earlier is the correct analysis, right? That's definitely not compensable. Elliot's point. It's definitely not. This buying at an inflated purchase price, definitely not compensable. It's a little weird, right? But it's not. That's the whole point of Dura. That if Dura stands for something, it stands for the fact that this situation is not compensable. Kind of weird, right? Kind of weird. Some of you are not convinced. You have to. Joe.
This is just a technical question about having this as a multiple choice question on the exam. So obviously there are at least two things you could ask about it, one of which there's clearly debate on because Farrell and Saha disagree with all these other people. I feel like if that's the kind of multiple choice question, my question would be, how do we know which position to answer? But if your question is just, is this compensable under Dura, then it's more objective.
So if the question is, investor buys, in this situation, buys at 100, And forget about the EU, okay? Company makes a misstatement. Price goes up. Investor buys at an inflated price. Truth is never revealed to the market. Damages or no damages? No. No ambiguity. Dura stood for that proposition. Completely, unequivocally black letter law. Buying at inflated prices is not, in the view of the Supreme Court, damage, loss, economic loss. You must attribute some subsequent actual loss of cash. Remember how the court justifies this. Okay, they pull out their financial economics tool from their toolkit and they say, you guys don't understand the basics of finance. How much was the share worth that you bought on this day? You guys remember this from Dura? What did the court say in Dura? Why is it that the investor didn't lose anything by buying this share in the view of the Supreme Court? Okay, she or she paid $100 for a share worth, say it? 100. That's the holding in Dura. You guys see this, right? You paid $100 for a share worth $100. Therefore, you lost nothing. You see how the court thinks? Okay? All right. So yes, to Joe's question, if that is a question, there is one answer, one correct answer. Now, there's some disagreement over if the EU announces the tariffs, if this loss in value is compensable under Dura. What they are troubled by is that if the answer is yes, then it really narrows the holding in Dura. Right? Because basically, the truth is never revealed to the market. What bothers Farrell and Saha is that the truth is never revealed to the market. And so how can you say that this decline was caused by the misstatement? Except something else affected the value of the stock, and in a but-for sense would not have affected the value of the stock but for the misstatement. Now we're back to torts, right? But for causation versus proximate cause. Here you have but for causation, but it's not close enough in their view. Except that the test isn't really foreseeability. It's that there's been no corrective disclosure. All right. Everyone sees it. Okay, here's a hypothetical. What if you sold at 80? You sold the day before the misstatement at 80, and you bring suit claiming that the misstatement caused an economic loss of $20. Because if you had heard the misstatement, you would not have sold. And if you had heard the misstatement, you would not have sold, and you would have made $20. Compensable or no? No? Why not? What? Why would that be compensable? I don't know. I'm just asking you. Is it compensable? No. Okay. Why not? What element does it fail? What's that? Might fail loss causation, Martin.
I mean, there hasn't even been a misstatement.
Yeah. Right. So good. Right. So there's no misstatement if at the time you sold the shares. Well, there was a misstatement after, but okay, you need to have in connection with, right, the purchase or sale of a security. So here you had a misstatement, but it was not in connection with your sale. All right. What if you sold? Now, we probably covered all the cases. If you sell here, you made some money because of the misstatement. So you don't have any damage claim. Okay, does everyone see this? Yes, in the back. Tell me your name.
Caroline?
Hi, Caroline. Yes.
Maybe I'm just misunderstanding something, but with the EU, if you were to kind of ride the wave and then went back down to 90, I mean, that would not be compensable, right? Because you're still better off than if the misstatement hadn't been made in the first place and the stock price had stayed at 80. So, like, if the misstatement comes out, I mean, I
You're
guess
better off.
Yeah, and so you wouldn't be able to be compensated for that economic
that's
loss.
interesting. Okay, so Caroline wants to argue that you're better off because if the misstatement hadn't been made, what price would you have bought the stock at?
I mean, if the misstatement had been made, so probably at 80.
Right.
Say, like, if you bought it at 80 and you rode the wave and you tried to sue about the, like, EU tariff stuff,
Yeah.
or whatever, like, you're still better off than if the misstatement never happened in the first place.
Okay, so Caroline moves this back to buying at 80. Buying at 80, you start making money immediately off the misstatement. You're better off because they lied. And your point is, yeah, you can't really sue for a loss because you're better off. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Amy.
So imagine that there was a corrective disclosure that
Yeah.
revealed 80 is the true value of the
Yeah.
loan, and then at the same time that there was the EU tariff policy.
Good.
Down to like 70.
What happens?
Is that like, well, as a plaintiff, you probably would allege your damages are corrective disclosure. I don't know.
Why do you think it's going to go to 70?
Or whatever it is, whatever like 10% of 80 or
I think it's going to go to 80.
even with the EU.
Yeah. So remember, the EU affects the value of the spare capacity. And if you have no spare capacity, then now this goes back to Jessica's point. So it's a little unclear whether the EU tariff affects just the demand for whatever this company's manufacturing or the value of the spare capacity, which is sort of the core of the misstatement.
Yeah, I would think it may affect like demand for the product.
Yeah.
I guess my question is then the role of the event study to try to, like, if you're on the defendant side and you know you're going to be like
Right.
liable for damages, but you want to limit it, so your role then is to try to separate like what the decline is due to the corrective disclosure, like this statement,
Yep.
versus that's what the event study.
Absolutely. And so you really, if you have high frequency data, you will try to separate those two events at the high frequency, appropriately controlling for the market and other industry-specific news. But yeah, that's why these experts get paid big bucks, because a lot rides on this. All right, so let's move on to, by the way, there's this nice little analysis, I'll just say briefly. What about the economics of this situation? Has the investor suffered a loss of the tariff situation in an economic sense? The answer turns on whether one looks at the situation ex post or ex ante, as usual, right? You now should be very familiar with this. Ex ante, the investor is as likely to be the beneficiary of changes in the market's valuation placed on spare capacity as it is that the investor will incur losses as a result of the change. Imagine, this is their point, this is a key point. Imagine the hypothetical where the investor might have would have gained if the market placed a greater value on having spare capacity between the time of the purchase and sale. Indeed, an investor might have purchased the stock betting that would happen. So their intuition as economists, which I think is pretty convincing, is that when you were here, you had a sort of equal chance, okay, or whatever the chances were, they were outside your control. You were placing a bet on either no tariff action, positive tariff action, or negative tariff action. And by making that compensable, what the law is doing is giving you a put option, meaning it's giving you insurance against the downward scenario. Free insurance. And why should it do that? On the other hand, if a corrective disclosure had occurred, you can think about it like you never, as an investor, took the risk. This would be the argument. See how persuasive you find it. Just think about it. You didn't take the risk of fraud. That's sort of like the ultimate assumption in all of this analysis, right? You didn't really assume the risk of fraud. And so when we insure you on the downside against fraud, we're actually not insuring you against a risk that you took when you bought the stock. You should have an intuition now that you should start resisting that kind of an argument. Who decides what risks you took when you bought the stock? We don't really know. That's the whole point. You took whatever risks the law gave you or made you take. And we're trying to decide what the law is. That circularity now should be starting to become second nature. We've discussed it over and over and over again. Be wary of arguments like investors assume risk X when they do something. Who knows what risks they assume? They assume whatever risks the law tells them they need to assume, and we're trying to decide what the law is. So be wary. And why is it that investors don't assume the risk of fraud? I don't know. Maybe they do. And maybe they pay prices accordingly. Okay, theoretical point and parentheses. Let's move on. What constitutes a corrective disclosure? We discussed the non-price change setting, and let's just review their discussion. So I'm going to read on 173. The discussion of the Fifth Circuit case in Greenberg v. Crossroads Systems, the issue of when the negative stock price reactions to downward earnings projections can form the basis for establishing loss causation is often quite important both in its own right as well as for raising the general issue of whether a disclosure constitutes a corrective disclosure with respect to earlier misstatements when the disclosure does not directly indicate that the earlier statements were false. One common claim is that a disclosure should be deemed corrective when that disclosure reveals the true financial condition of the company that was being concealed by the earlier misstatement. According to this approach, the fact that no wrongdoing or error has been identified is unimportant. The company's true performance has entered the market, and the market will react to that. So you can immediately see that this whole analysis really turns on what you consider to be sort of the legitimate cause, a legitimate corrective disclosure, or kind of like the legitimate, thing that can right the wrong that the investors suffered. So if you say, so what if the company just announces, like, here's our financial position, or here's our capacity, and it doesn't say that the prior projection was misleading in any way. It just tells you, here's our income statement, here's our balance sheet. Oh, that's a brain twister, right? Like, that's hard. Because it's not the EU imposing something from the outside. It's actually the firm giving information that is ambiguous as to whether or not it's actually correcting the disclosure. And I don't know, should we be relying on the price change? Like, does this price change indicate unequivocally, say the price goes down, unequivocally that the market learned that the prior statement was false? And their point is, no, that's not so clear. Why? Well, anytime you state the true financial condition, you in fact are giving the market new information. And that new information could be the cause. Kind of like the EU, something else has entered the market at this point. Wow, okay, that's complicated, right? So turns out we have 10% spare capacity. Say that's the statement. And then you say our spare capacity is 50. I don't know, pick a number. Is that correcting the prior misstatement, or is that sending a new signal about your sales or your income or your business prospects? Probably can be argued either way. And the point they make is that any negative firm news can contain important information. And here's the issue. There is the possibility, I'm reading from the bottom of page 173, that if the timing of the intent to restate and the timing of the downward adjusted earnings projection had been switched, we would have observed exactly the same stock price reaction. In other words, they're saying, look, the problem is that we don't know if they had made this announcement before, like back over here, we don't know if the stock price would have still gone down. And because that's really analytically the issue. We don't know if it would have gone down. Actually, like more like here, right? From there, from 80, right? So we don't know. So because we don't know, we kind of can't be sure. You can see that they are pro-defendant, right? It gets harder and harder as you go through Farrell and Saha to find a basis of liability. You've got to come out and say, we lied. All right. All right, post-corrective disclosure stock price movements, 175. An important issue that often arises. Oh, first of all, are there any questions on this? Are we all in the same? Okay, you've been asking questions. All right. An important issue that often arises in estimating securities damage concerns stock price movements in the period immediately following the corrective disclosure. In a number of circumstances, the stock price of the firm recovers in the immediate post-corrective disclosure period. What impact, if any, do these movements have on the damages per share calculation? All right, so the story is, let's say there is a corrective disclosure. Now we're going to say there is a corrective disclosure. The stock price falls, and then it rises. This is really important. This happens all the time. So first of all, they clarify a point that some of you might be confused by, which is that Section 21D limits damages to the average trading price of the securities in the 90-day period following the corrective disclosure. But that is just a cap. Does everyone see this? So whatever the prices are after, we go 90 days out, okay, there's going to be some average you're going to take, and that average is the maximum damages that you can receive. All right? But that's not the calculation of the damage claim. Has Adam arrived? No. All right. So Adam asked me via email how you calculate damages for, this is why I didn't want to put the recordings online, but all right. Adam asked, how do you calculate damages when you don't have, when you have different people buying at different points in time, and how is loss causation a common question to the class? Because you would think that loss causation has to be an individualized calculation. And the answer is it's actually not. First of all, Halliburton 1 makes clear that you need not establish loss causation at class certification, but the actual damage calculation is not an individualized damage calculation. Just make sure this point is clear. It is a class-wide damage calculation. And to see how this works, let's just unpack this. So in the paper, you should have the picture. Let's see. Well, I don't want to waste time pulling it up, but you have the picture here of the stock price of Ahold. Okay, it's in the article. So basically, it kind of follows a similar pattern, right? There's a decline, and then it kind of goes back up. And then the question, so their analysis is as follows. The critical question on page 178 is, what is the impact of the curative disclosure? And the point they make is that it depends on what time period you use to calculate the effect of the curative disclosure. So we're going to talk in a minute about future casting and back casting, which has to do with establishing the price at which you bought. But here we're asking, what is the curative price? So you can imagine the damage calculation, just so we're all on the same page, looks something like the following. True price minus false price times number of shares. Okay, that's the simplest possible elementary calculation of damages, right? True price minus false price times number of shares. The first question we're trying to establish is, what is the true price? All right, so everyone on the same page. And the point they're making is, well, the true price can be either the price immediately following the corrective disclosure, or it can be some price in the future. And how do you know what the true price is? I don't know. Well, you have to make some assumption about whether the subsequent reaction to the price was overreaction. Say that differently. Was a correction of an overreaction, or whether it's actually new information, right? And this is pretty tough, right? Because, you know, you could think that the market doesn't immediately fully realize the impact of the information, in which case this could be too small, right? You could say the market overreacts to the impact of the information, in which case this is too big. And if you're trying to decide whether the market's underreacting, overreacting, or getting it right, you might point to the fact that the price goes back up and reverses direction. The problem is that that would be completely indistinguishable from a case where the market got it right, and then some other news unfolds, and the stock price climbs back up. So this is going to be a debated, disputed point. Abir.
Was this discussion, did this discussion we just had fit under the loss causation prong?
Yes.
Because if the assumption underlying the class certification is the efficient market hypothesis, shouldn't it always be the first?
Good.
The first moment, not the one that happened, because it's all instantly reflected in the price.
I agree. What's the first moment? All right, let's look at the picture. I'll give you 3 different candidates. I don't know if you can see this. The first moment could be here, here, or here. Or maybe right here. What's first?
Shouldn't be the closing price on the day the disclosure is made?
Well, if the market is efficient, why don't we use the minute after the disclosure was made? You see, this is kind of like an endless, we're never going to get out of this, right? Like, if the market is really efficient, then we should use the millisecond after the disclosure is made. And probably nothing has happened. If the market is, like, kind of efficient, then we'll use, like, 3 hours after. If the market is, like, more or less efficient, what did the court say in Halliburton 2? We're not going to decide whether the market is, like, actually efficient. We think it's just generally efficient. So if the market is generally efficient, then we'll use the end of the price at the end of the day. So I guess if you announce something in the morning, it takes longer than if you announce it at 3 p.m. This is all arbitrary, right? I mean, you're just going to pick a moment. Yes, the experts will battle it out over this. This is really important, right? There's no legal answer here. It's going to turn on the data, on the evidence. You're going to try to use econometric methodology to separate out other things that could be driving the price. You're going to try to point to the presence or absence of additional news along the way. Sometimes it might be, for example, that the first news article doesn't move the price very much, but then it gets picked up by like the AP or something and sort of retweeted effectively, right? Many, many, many times. And it's the retweets, the reprints that actually move the price, as more people realize. The mechanisms of market efficiency is kind of a really interesting topic and was the subject of a paper. But at the end of the day, the answer is the mechanism of market efficiency really is very specific to each piece of news and turns on how exactly information makes its way into the price. Now, this should be sort of ringing bells in your head because we had an entire conversation about how information makes its way into prices when we talked about high-frequency traders and insider trading. And so, in a way, that efficiency of the market is actually just another way of describing the problem we analyzed, which is how informed traders compete with each other to capture the profit from information. And in this case, even though it's a public disclosure, I've used the term informed listening to refer to those folks who have an incentive to bid the price as fast as they can to the true level. Of course, then the question is, what is the true level? And part of this conversation that we had around many or few informed traders should remind you that, in fact, informed traders have an incentive to bid very slowly unless they face competition. So market efficiency, in a way, is actually decreasing in the short term if you have, to the extent you have kind of a monopolist, right? So if I'm the only one who knows the information or can trade on it, I will trade slowly. And so one way to think about market efficiency is that markets are more efficient to the extent that more people can figure out what the information means, and they will trade on it more quickly as a result. Do you have a follow-up?
So is the real problem does a real problem occur if the rebound happens on the same day? Because otherwise, the damages in any ways are capped with a 90-day average. So if you're just focusing on loss causation itself, the problem would be if the rebound happens on the same day, right? Not if it happens on a following day. Because the price drops the day the disclosure occurs, that means that a loss has been caused, technically, I think. But the damages could be reduced if the price rebounds on the following days. So the real issue in proving loss causation would occur if the price rebounds on the same day, right?
I'm not sure those. I think it is true that if the price rebounds, you have a loss causation on the same day. You have a loss causation problem. It's also true that if the price, suppose this is not one day, but this is 89 of the 90 days. Okay, so the price declines very slowly over 89 of the coming 90 days, and then moves back up on day 90. The average will be really low, right? The average will be somewhere down here. And so that means that the true price is going to be pretty close to where it ultimately landed. Right? Depends on how steep that curve is and so forth. So it's not the but you're still going to have a loss causation problem because you have to decide the moment at which the market has figured it out. And if each of these red circles that look kind of purplish here are day 10, 20, 30, well, how long does it take the market to figure it out? Like, it can't be that long. And so you'd have a real loss causation problem that would not implicate the 21D cap if you had a situation like this where the price crawled very, 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 very slowly. Because that would drag the average down, yet you would still have a hard time establishing that, in fact, the efficient market had decided the price was the one on day 89. It's a long time. Right? So you still have to find the day that determines the true value. So let's continue with the discussion on page 185. Yes, Martin?
Just to clarify, like in a real-world situation, although the graph that's given on page 177 is stock price, we'd actually be looking at like abnormal returns, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. This would all be done with abnormal returns, but we would be multiplying what are effectively percentages by some normalizing price, right? Maybe the price at the beginning of the period. But yeah, you could actually repeat this analysis. You would use returns, but sort of adjust it back to the prices that are underlying those returns, right? Because a percentage change can always be translated to an actual level difference. Yeah, good one. Yeah, Abir?
Follow-up question to your response to my previous question.
Yeah.
So if you don't know what the true price is, how do you know when to start the 21D window?
No, the 21D window starts from the moment of the corrective disclosure.
Okay.
Yeah. So truth is announced. 90 days, that's your cap on damages. Problem is, you got to figure out when the market has learned the truth. And that becomes complicated if the price bounces back up. Arguably, the most that happens in the case where this is 89 of the 90 days is that you kind of understate the damages. But that matters too, right? I mean, so yes, that is an unrealistic story, that it takes 89 days for the market to. Much more realistic is that in the course of a few hours, the price drops and then recovers. And so intraday, maybe the closing price doesn't change at all. But intraday, you have to argue that the market reacted to the information. And that is going to be a tough one, right? You've got to really establish that it wasn't an overreaction. The key point I want you to take away from this discussion here is the concern around overreactions, right? You need to always be attuned to the claim that whatever happened that caused the price to increase after was actually not new information, but the market realizing that it was too pessimistic to begin with. Paul?
I was thinking when you have that correction,
yeah.
I'm someone who owns the stock, the price goes down, goes back up. I essentially have no damages. So I just...
You don't have damages?
Don't have damages at all.
Why?
Because I'm holding the stock, it's at, let's say, the price of 90. It goes down intraday to 80 and it goes back up to 90. I still have a stock worth 90.
Yeah, but in the counterfactual, in the absence of the misstatement, you could have potentially had a stock worth 100. See, that Farrell and Sah's point is that's the problem, right? We don't know whether the subsequent increase was just, in a logical sense, another step in the causal chain towards the market correcting for the information, in which case your claim would be right. You'd say, well, yeah, I actually didn't lose anything because the market decided that the price was actually still 90. The other way to interpret the exact same facts is the market, the market has concluded that I lost $10. That's the impact of the information. But something else happened in the industry, in the firm, whatever, that now makes the firm worth $10 more. And if the misstatement hadn't been made, I would have been entitled to that $10. So that offsets. That doesn't offset my loss, right? That's the whole point. It's a bit of a chicken in the egg. Let's talk in our last 10 minutes here about forward casting and back casting. Page 185. I'm just going to read this, and we'll try to figure it out. This took me a while. In estimating per share damages, plaintiffs use plaintiffs experts typically adopt a back casting approach. That is, they use the price decline as a result of the curative disclosure to measure the inflation during the class period. In particular, let's just walk through how this works. They begin with share prices at the end of the class period, which presumably reflect the fair market value of the security. Suppose there was a corrective disclosure. And proceed backward in time to the beginning of the class period in constructing the but-for share price line. All right, so let's think of the inflation that happens. Then there's a corrective disclosure. And the way that the backcasting approach works is that you begin here, and you proceed backward in time. Let's change colors. So you begin here, and you proceed backward in time to establish a but-for share price line. That's the but-for share price. This is called backcasting. All right. And they say, and so the difference between the actual share price and the backcasted but-for price is purported to provide a measure of per share damages. In other words, what is the damage amount? It's the area under this curve. Right? Complete mess. Okay. So it's the difference multiplied by the number of shares that are transacted over that period. Is this clear? This is pretty simple, right? All right. But they don't like the backcasting approach, of course, because they're consultants to defendants. And so they say, look, it has a lot of problems. Overreactions, corrective disclosure price movement, collateral damage, Apportionment issues can render it difficult to estimate with any degree of reliability. So in other words, what they're saying is, look, what's the problem? Imagine that the price kind of did a number like this where it, where'd my blue one go? Where it basically overreacted. Like we kind of agree that it overreacted because it kind of went back up. I'm going to say, all right, well, you're going to use this moment to build the backcasting, and that's kind of not good. So because you're not adjusting for the overreaction. All right. I don't know why you couldn't just use the overreaction price, but they seem to like forward casting. So what is forward casting? See if I can draw this so that somebody can see it. So forward casting, you estimate the inflation in the stock price associated with the misrepresentation announcement as opposed to inferring the extent of the inflation from the price decline associated with the curative disclosure. The doctrines, they argue this is legally correct because the doctrines of loss causation, reliance, and materiality all point to the inflation in the stock price as the potential harm to shareholders associated with the misrepresentation. Yeah, I guess. If you didn't read Dura, then you... OK, so Dura says inflation alone is not enough, but they seem to like the idea that inflation is the harm. And they're right. Inflation is the harm in a kind of unique way. So let's break this down. The application of the forward-casting approach is straightforward when the false information, which the market believes is true, was unanticipated by the market. In such an event, the stock price reaction associated with the initial dissemination would represent the inflation in stock price. And then they discuss the confirmatory statements which we talked about, and they give the following hypothetical. Suppose, for instance, that a firm overstates its earnings in order to meet the market's earnings expectation, and there is accordingly no market reaction to the misrepresentation. In that case, the forward-casting approach would entail estimating what the market reaction would have been had the restated lower earnings been known on the misstated earnings announcement day. This estimation can be undertaken using an event study from the prior earnings announcements days and quantifying the relationship. So let's break down what they're saying. So they're basically saying, look, suppose that on the day of the misstatement, there's actually no price movement. They want to use a forward-casting approach because they think that the back-casting has problems, whereby the forward-casting approach would in principle try to estimate directly the amount of the inflation. But then they anticipate your critique that what if there's no price change in the case of a confirmatory misrepresentation? Well, they really don't want to use the subsequent decline in the price. That's what's driving this forward-casting preference, right? Why? Because they're worried that, particularly like in the case of a confirmatory misrepresentation, they're worried that some other information is driving this price decline. So they say, we got to stop using backcasting. We've got to stop using this and inferring backwards because we don't really know that the price would have gone down by that much. We just don't know. We don't know. There's other things going on in this announcement. So what we're going to try to do is directly estimate the amount of the loss attributable to the misstatement. And the way we're going to do that is to use an event study using prior earnings announcements days and quantify the relationship between price response and earning surprises. And then we would then estimate but-for stock returns in the dates of the restated during this period. So in other words, what they want, well, let's leave that up there. So suppose the price falls. They don't want to use that, right? What they want to do, they want to say, suppose in the past, I have a bunch of earnings, I have a disappointing earnings announcement, and the price fell. I want to estimate an event study on that disappointing earnings announcement in the past. And then here, at the moment of the misstatement, I want to create a but-for line that is effectively what I thought would have happened if the truth were announced at the beginning of the period. And then I'll forward cast the amount of the damages here. So in our true price minus false price calculation, this is all about what the false price is, right? And here, the false price, their point is, well, let's put it like this. Here, you're actually using the actual false price, is one way to think about this, right? That is to say, you have a price all throughout this window, and what you're doing is like, you're choosing a true price, and you're subtracting the actual false price. Okay, so you're picking a true price, and you're subtracting the actual false price to come up with the damages. Here, you're doing just the opposite, right? You are choosing the true price. Sorry, you're choosing the false price, right? You're coming up with what this is, and you're saying, I'm going to actually use I'm going to create this but-for line, and I'm going to say that the difference between I've used my event study model to come up with what the false price, what the actual difference between the true price and the false price was at the beginning of time, and then I'm going to project that forward across the trades until the corrective disclosure is made. Yes?
Doesn't this stand on the premise that the design by the inflated price?
Yes.
And that's what the report projected. So doesn't the economist put himself in a losing position upfront by opting for this type of calculation?
Well, formally what they would say is no, because Dura requires, all Dura requires is that this happens. But what they're trying to do, you're right, they're trying to separate the price at which the corrective disclosure leads to. They're trying to separate that from the damage calculation by coming up with the hypothetical. You're absolutely right. But they would say, no, we're not actually, contradicting Dura, because we're still saying that the loss was caused by the earnings misstatement. We're just focusing on the hypothetical loss that would have resulted in the beginning of the period, right? If the truth were known at the beginning of the period. So we're not compensating the entire price inflation. No, no, no. It'll generally be less than the entire price inflation, because they won't be using they won't. You can think about it like effectively they're like this picture suggests, they're limiting the end price, right? That's the true price, because what they're saying is, look, we're not going to actually use the total decline. Instead, we're going to project from day zero what part of this decline was attributable to this information. And we're going to do that by using prior earnings announcements or whatever data source they have. And then we'll be able to separate the other stuff that's going in here to these overreactions or other information. We'll separate that out. Why? Because we'll start at the beginning of the period and we'll say this is actually the amount of not inflation, but the amount of true loss that's being caused when this decline happens by the misstatement, right? So you can think about it like by starting at the beginning, I effectively form the counterfactual from day one. In their minds, that's the right way to form the counterfactual, because that's actually what's happening. Every investor is buying at a price that is inflated by the amount that the decline can be explaining, right? So when you have this decline, you say, look, this decline was for a lot more, but I'm going to just focus on the part of the decline that was driven by the misinformation. Right, so you're right. I agree with your intuition, Michael. Like, it does seem like they're just using inflation, but they would say, no, no, no. We're actually constructing a hypothetical, right? A hypothetical price decline if the information had been announced earlier, and that's the correct approach in their view to calculating damages. Okay, what they don't want is they're worried about overreactions, right? So they don't want to debate around which of these you use. That's why this matters, right? In the backcasting approach, you have to pick a moment in time when you've decided what the true price is. You have to choose that true price. Here, you don't have to do that. You form a hypothetical, if you will, true price. And because you don't have to choose which moment in time is the true price, you're freed from worrying about this question of market efficiency, right? You're freed from worrying about what happened, how much of this decline was actually driven by the information. And you might say, as Magdalena points out, you freed yourself from Dura, or you think you have, because now your loss causation claim is very hypothetical, right? And I agree with you on that critique. All right, folks, we're out of time. Next week I'll answer questions you have on this. Come to office hours today. One more class, and we are done. Have a great weekend. You look completely unhappy with this. Maybe we'll work through an example. If you want to come to office hours, or we can do it next week.